Good afternoon. I'm Tracy Luff. I'm the chair of the Department of Sociology here at Concord University. I'd like to welcome all of the students, faculty, staff, and community members here in the Alexander Fine Arts Auditorium, as well as those watching the live stream on the internet to today's event at Concord University. On behalf of our sponsors, the Departments of Sociology and Social Work and the Divisions of Education and Social Sciences, I would like to say we are truly honored to be joined today by Jonathan Kozol. Thank you to everyone who has helped make this event happen, including Dr. Lawrence Eppard, Dr. Richard Drugish, Dr. John David Smith, and our wonderful technology services staff, William Bailey, Alvin White, and Gary Danovich. Without their hard work and expertise, these types of events wouldn't be possible. Today we will hear from nationally acclaimed education author Jonathan Kozol as he discusses what he sees as the biggest challenges facing American schools. After his talk, Mr. Kozol will take questions from the audience. But first, please join me in welcoming Concord University President Dr. Kendra Boggess to the podium to introduce our speaker.
I want to extend my welcome as well. It's wonderful to see so many students, community members, and faculty here to hear for this event. Thank you for your introduction, Dr. Luff, and I want to thank all of you who were involved in planning this, our event sponsors, Division of Social Science, Division of Education, Department of Sociology, Department of Social Work. We want to welcome all of you to today's event. It is truly an honor, and I'm grateful to be here today to introduce nationally recognized and widely acclaimed education author, Jonathan Kozol. Jonathan Kozol has devoted nearly his entire life to the challenge of providing an equal opportunity to every child in this country. He is famous for his 50 years of social justice advocacy amongst our nation's poorest and most vulnerable children, tirelessly working for all American children on such issues as school quality, racial segregation, and homelessness. In a country like the United States, with unprecedented childhood poverty rates in the wealthy world and extremely troubling and persistent racial inequality, I can't think of a speaker we should be paying more attention today on the most pressing issues than him. Many of his books are now considered classics, and they're widely read across fields and disciplines, including Savage Inequalities, a book concerning school inequality, Shame of the Nation, about the resegregation of America's neighborhoods and schools, and Rachel and Her Children, about children and their mothers dealing with homelessness. Jonathan Kozol has received many awards for his work, including the National Book Award and the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. His 1995 bestseller, Amazing Grace, received the Anisfield Wolf Book Award, an honor previously granted to the works of Langston Hughes and Dr. Martin Luther King. Today, Jonathan Kozol will be speaking to us about the major current challenges facing schools in the United States. Educators across the country are very familiar with Mr. Kozol's work, as he is among the nation's most widely read and most highly honored voices on American educational issues. I want to thank him so much for joining us today. And on a personal note, when I was in graduate school, he was not only recommended, he was someone we were required to read, and his books really do inform much of what goes on in the conversation about education today in the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Kozol to Concord University.
I just want to repeat my thanks to President Boggess, Tracy Luff, Lawrence Eppard, and I'm very fortunate to have a colleague here in Cambridge, Bridget Wack, who's technologically a good deal more sophisticated than I am. I was born in 1936, and my understanding of the internet is, well, I'm just barely getting into I'm just barely getting into the 21st century. So I'm very fortunate that Bridget made this possible. And of course, my thanks to each and every one of you, the students and faculty who are with us here today. As President Vargas told you, I've written several books about public education, low-income children, homelessness, hunger, and in recent years, particularly about the stunning rates of child poverty in the United States. Of all my books, the one that's been most widely read is Savage Inequalities. This is a book, I know some of you have read it. This is a book that describes in great detail the inequalities in funding between wealthy districts and low-income districts in the United States. And, you know, I wish that I could tell you today that those inequalities are a thing of the past, but that wouldn't be the truth. In many states, those inequalities remain every bit as severe as they were when I wrote that book. And in the majority of cases, the inequalities are even greater. They've widened in recent years. I go into school districts where as little as $7,000 or $8,000 is spent per pupil for every child in a given year. And then I go into affluent suburban districts where more than $20,000 is spent on every child every single year. Now, admittedly, there are some low-income districts in which it may appear that funding is equal because the state puts in enough money to bring all districts up to what they call a basic minimum. The trouble is that it's not authentic equity because low-income children have far greater needs than children of the privileged. And I don't know a single state in which equity adjusted for the greater needs of low-income children has been achieved. There are many states that claim to have arrived at that wonderful democratic level, but in most states, the savage inequalities go on and on and on. The second point, which may not seem directly relevant to those of you in West Virginia, but is a devastating factor in the national arena, is the troubling reality of wildly resurgent racial segregation in our nation's schools. In part because of very damaging Supreme Court decisions that have been made since the early 1980s, virtually all the gains achieved in the era of civil rights have been reversed. At the present moment, Black and Hispanic children in the United States are more isolated intellectually and segregated physically than at any time since 1968, the year in which Dr. Martin Luther King was taken from us by assassination. Now, I'm an old-fashioned guy in this respect. I still believe that Dr. King was right. I still believe the Warren Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education was correct in telling us that separate education is inherently unequal and does tremendous damage to the young mentalities of children who recognize very, very quickly that they have been set apart as if they were an infectious subspecies of the population so that they cannot contaminate the education of more fortunate children in America. I don't want to dwell on this issue because it's not so pertinent in West Virginia, but I know many of you will be going into other states, especially students. People nowadays cross state borders all the time, settle in California and New York, wherever else, no matter where you're born. And I think this is, to me, this is one of the most important issues that we face today. And it just breaks my heart that neither political party is willing to speak of this. They will tell you they've found, a new magic pill that works for low-income children. And I'll get into that in a moment. They will tell you, educators have heard this, there's a new set of so-called best practices which will turn it all around for low-income children. And we've been doing this now, ever since No Child Left Behind was enacted 15 years ago, and it simply has not come anywhere near reducing the enormous gap in outcomes between the children of different races and children of vastly different economic levels. I just hope that I hope that all of you will take this very seriously, and not just write it off as as if I were somehow just harking back to the years when I was young, in which it seemed that the nation was willing to address this issue. In a sense, we've turned our back on the entire legacy for which not only Dr. Martin Luther King, but Fannie Lou Hamer and thousands of young people, white and black, struggled so hard, which many gave their lives half a century ago. Now, add to this the pathological mania of obsessive testing that exists in almost every state, and which has had the effect of shriveling the curriculum, that narrowing the breadth of skills we teach to those that are reducible to numbers on a standardized exam, squeezing out the arts and music and most of the humanities, sucking out almost every bit of joy and jubilation from the act of learning for its own good sake alone, forcing schools to spend sometimes 1/2 or even 2/3 of the school year drilling children for their examinations, blinding us too often to the actual potential of millions of poor children. And worst of all, perhaps fostering a terrible passivity, what I call cognitive docility, and suppressing critical capacities, suppressing the ability to ask discerning questions about the world, about our nation, about the status quo, about the present order of society, and about their place within it. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not opposed to testing if it's useful testing, by which I mean diagnostic testing, testing which the teacher carries out right there in the classroom, and which she doesn't have to wait. I'm saying she because I'm thinking of the early elementary grades where most of my fellow teachers were women. The teacher, and still the majority of elementary school teachers, the vast majority are women. The kind of diagnostic test that a teacher gives right there in the classroom. She doesn't have to wait 3 months or 6 months for the test scores to come back from one of these multi-global testing corporations. She knows the next day or within a matter of minutes, where, one child needs help in verb endings, another child in long division, But standardized exams do not give this kind of help. They tell the teacher nothing that is useful in the classroom. Their function is almost exclusively punitive, post hoc, and judgmental. The purpose of these tests, in my own belief, tests which have been most fervently promoted by privatizing forces, I'm being absolutely candid now, the primary purpose of these tests, in my belief, has been to humiliate our teachers, to suppress their creativity, to deny them professional autonomy, and meanwhile to persuade the public that our public school system is a failure, and in turn to establish a scenario in which profit-making corporations can invade the public sector and establish voucher schemes or charter schools, which have long been the deeply treasured goal of extreme conservatives in the United States, going back as far as the 1950s. And the end result, in my belief, is not only to open up the door to predatory corporations, the testing corporations themselves, companies like Pearson, are already not simply making millions of dollars from selling the tests, but they're also creating curricula in our public schools that are aligned with the exams. But it's not, in my belief, the agenda here is not simply to make profits for the private sector, but also to reconstruct the consciousness of citizens in keeping with the interests of the privileged. And this is, and I'm not narrowing this to any specific state, or any specific region of the country, whether we're speaking of Hispanic kids in California, where I've been spending time in schools quite recently, or Black kids in New York, where several of my books take place, or simply low-income white kids in low-income rural areas in West Virginia and Southern Ohio and parts of Virginia, children who grow up in Appalachian communities. Wherever this happens, I believe this effort on the part of the private sector to appropriate the consciousness of citizens is incompatible with the true needs of democracy. Well, I wish we had more time today, but in the minutes that remain, I'm going to switch my focus just a bit, because I want to say a word or two about the actual content of instruction and curriculum, and what's sometimes called the canon in the social sciences and the humanities, not only in our middle schools and high schools, but in our universities as well. Almost exactly 30 years ago, a man I knew named E.D. Hirsch published a book with the title Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know. That's the subtitle of the book, What Every American Needs to Know. I hated that book because I didn't know half the things it said I needed to know. I thought I'd been fairly well educated at Harvard and later at Oxford, but the book made me imagine that I was ignorant of history and culture. I imagine what does it do to other people, children who have never had these opportunities. But I also disliked the book because the items that it listed, in history, for instance, were stridently selective and obviously biased in their nature. The facts and dates and concepts in that book have since become the heart of something that is widely accepted in our public schools. It's called, quote, essential knowledge. And in colleges and universities, it's often had a role in shaping first-year courses in what is often called the Common Core, or the core curriculum. I guess that's the typical term in first-year courses at many universities. Now, I'm not one of those wildly romantic guys who think that we can blissfully ignore all the facts and dates and famous names of history and sequences of wars and conflicts between nations and where things are. Where's Beijing? Where's London? Where's Baghdad? Where's Aleppo? Where's Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria? No, I think we need to have some sense of where things are and when things happened. Why was there a World War I? Why was there a League of Nations? What led up to the Great Depression? What led up to World War II? Students need to know what I would call the longitude and latitude of their existence, of their place in time and space. Without that context, without some context of that nation, we'd be in limbo. But I would also say, I think it's a great disservice to our students to give them the impression that history is always and forever something that is done by someone else, by someone bigger, better, smarter, more important than they, or more important than they are today or can ever hope to be. That's the message that it sends. And what it does, in my belief, is to amputate their sense of agency, to give them the impression that their own behaviors and those of their parents and grandparents and ancestors and those of other ordinary, hardworking people in this nation and the world count for nothing in our estimation and count for nothing in the eyes of history, especially with children of low income. What this does, in my belief, is to tell them, in effect, that their ideas, their experience, and their most deeply held convictions simply do not matter very much. So why even bother to express them? When I talk to students at colleges and high schools, I always try to give them a very different message. I always try to say to them something that goes like this. History is not only something that is done by people who have famous names and died 200 or 2,000 years ago and whose stories are now retold in very boring columns of gray ink in the textbooks that we give you. History is also what you do on Monday morning about the longings and ideals and visions of justice that you had the night before. You don't need to look at history forever in a helpless and subordinate position. You can enter history in order to transform it. I always wished that when I was a student, one of my teachers had talked like that to me. I wish the courses I was taking and the books that I was reading had not left me with the feeling, had not left me feeling overwhelmed and suffocated under the tremendous weight of history. It would have done a world of good for me if I could have gone on to college with a stronger sense of what I'd call aspirational audacity. I would have been a better teacher to the children that I later taught. I would have been a better ally to their parents, the parents of those children, when they rose up in outrage at the way their kids were being cheated in their miserable schools and went out to protest in the streets. It took me too long to find the courage to stand up and act in keeping with my conscience. And, I say this in all candor, looking back. I hope we can give a stronger sense of ethical empowerment to those we're teaching now. If we really want to close the so-called achievement gap, I call it the learning gap, between the races and the economic classes, I think that this is one of the most effective and dynamic ways to unlock motivation and ignite a passionate engagement in the act of learning for every single child in this land. Well, I'm getting a warning sign. We've only got about 5 minutes left. Let me just say briefly that one of the other consequences of this testing craze and the ethos that's come into public education in these recent years, and I must say not by the will of teachers, and usually not by the will of local school boards, but almost entirely by top-down dictates that are coming from the federal government. One of the worst results, one of the worst effects of all of this I've seen is a dangerous emphasis on constant competition. Competition between schools, which one posts the highest scores. Competition between teachers, which teacher pumps the test scores fastest and quickest and most dramatically, and competition between children in our schools. This kind of competition militates against everything I value most in education: collaboration, collective decency, compassionate concern for the little boy or little girl sitting right there next to you. I noticed that in the goals established for the Common Core, which is required now as sort of a guideline for almost every state board of education, I've looked in vain to find any reference to outcomes such as compassion, generosity, moral decency, kindliness of spirit, or even the well-being, the happiness of children in the schools. The entire thrust is, even if they don't always use these kinds of words, the entire thrust is not on the child as a child is today, but on some future incarnation of the child as a useful worker and an asset to our nation in sharpening our competitive edge in the global marketplace. I hear that term all the time. That we need you to toughen up your attitude towards children, get them into line. Why? Not for their own good, but because they're, because they're the people we need to beat out the entire rest of the world in economic competition. So, and I hear language in which advocates for this type of sort of rigid, rote and drill, test-driven instruction don't even refer to students as children. They refer to them as products. The child is the product of the school. The school is a production line. I've seen that term frequently used. So that and the child isn't valued for who she is right now, who he is right now. 6 years old, weighing 50 pounds. No, the child is valued only as a sort of a productive unit who needs to be polished enough to be a saleable commodity. I hope my friends in West Virginia can resist that trend with all the passion that you have. Well, I'm going to end now with an apology. I apologize for sounding like a preacher. I know I've fallen into the tone of a preacher, and the fact is, I preach a lot in churches, in Christian churches, even though I happen to be Jewish. I don't know why, but I get invited to speak in a lot of churches and cathedrals, Baptist churches, Methodist, Catholic, Episcopalian. For some reason, the Episcopalians invite me the most. I don't know why. I think they're after me. I think they're trying to convert me. It won't work, but I love that opportunity. And of all the churches in which I've preached, my favorite is probably the ultimate American cathedral, the one in Washington. Some of you have probably visited the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. I've preached there several times, and I can't tell you how much I like preaching there, because that's the place where our politicians go to pray. And I can't tell you how much joy it gives me as a Jew to preach the words of Jesus to delinquent Christians. And there are a lot of them in Washington. I'd love to see the day when the people who throng into churches like the National Cathedral, properly dressed for Sunday prayer, would go home at night and think of some of the values in the gospel, and then apply them to creating a kind of truly just and fair and full democracy, which is always within our power, and simply depends on the collective will and moral courage of our nation. So thanks a lot for listening. Thank you very much.
At this time, Mr. Kozol would like to field questions from the audience. If you have a question, please come down to the microphone at the front of the auditorium. While we wait for people to make their way to the microphone, I'll open the Q&A session with a few pre-submitted questions from students and faculty. Our first question goes like this. Mr. Kozol, what is your impression of the charter school movement in our country, both in terms of the motivations of those leading the movement, as well as the consequences for our educational system?
Well, it's a very timely question. We're in the midst of a big charter school battle right now in Massachusetts, and I'll tell you how I feel about it. There are some good charter schools here and there in the country. There are plenty that aren't good, and there are some that are notorious for not only for terrible funding irregularities, but also for abusive treatment of children. Many of the charter schools that post the highest scores and might look the best to people who have never been within those schools. Many of those schools engage in humiliating rituals. I call them shaming rituals, in order to whip their students into line, to make sure that every child is obediently going through all the rote and drill exercises to get them ready for exams. They put enormous emphasis on the tests at the expense of all the other values of education. I call these schools, I call them test prep factories. And, you know, they'll humiliate kids who don't cooperate. I mean, in ways that would be rejected in almost any public school, but they're not overseen closely. So, you know, that's one problem that I have. A second problem is that the high scores many of them post are skewed in a couple of ways. One of the most obvious ways is that when parents apply to these schools, it often looks as though it's wide open to anybody. They have lotteries. States run lotteries for the charter schools typically. It looks as though it's an even playing field. The trouble is that even if the schools don't actually select the kids they want, the enrollment is self-selective to a large degree because the kids who get into these schools are usually the children of parents who have the greatest social capital. I mean, even not speaking of economic level, many of these schools will say, you know, our students reflect the same low economic level as everybody in this poor community. That may be true, but that's not the point. The self-selectivity has to do with the navigation skills of those that we sometimes call the savvy parents, the parents who have good elbow pushing skills and know how to get to the front of the line, who hear about the school, who hear about the deadline for the lottery, and who are also able to sign contracts, which most of these schools require, to back up the school in literacy work and other areas at home, which is a very nice thing to do, and we wish all parents could do this, but it typically excludes the parents who have very limited literacy, who are recent immigrants to the United States and lack English language fluency, parents whose lives are difficult, whose lives are troubled, who deal with physical illness, emotional illness. What it's doing is it's filtering out the most privileged among the poor, and it's creating sort of a double class. Well, what's wrong with that, you might say? One thing that's wrong with it is that those are the parents we typically rely upon to advocate for children in the public schools. Those are the parents we need in the PTA. Those are the parents who have the political clout or the public advocacy skills to go in front of a state board of education and say, we want more money in this school. We need a better library. We need you to rebuild the building. We're losing all those parents. They're not going to fight for our kids anymore. What this amounts to is a narrowing of civic virtue to the smallest possible parameters. I might add one other point. Charter schools are notoriously the most segregated schools in the United States. So at a time when racial divisions have widened greatly and when, as we see in the streets of cities all over the country, there's a terrible fear and mistrust between black citizens and white law officers, for example. Nothing could be worse than to separate them physically from the day they enter school.
Thank you. We have some more pre-submitted questions for you. Mr. Kozol, why do you think we have such a hard time solving problems like childhood poverty and educational inequality in the country relative to many other wealthy nations?
Well, I won't try to deal with child poverty in itself because that would take another hour, but one reason, one of the most obvious reasons why we do not deal with the root causes of inequality in public education is that we are still stuck with an archaic, long outdated system of school finance in America that depends initially primarily on taxing local property. So a town in which there are a whole bunch of $1 million homes is going to end up with $1 million school system. And a community in which the homes are worth $50,000 or less is going to end up with a badly underfinanced school system. And the states, as I pointed out before, allegedly have equalizing formulas, but they never do the job. I don't know any other modern developed nation that still uses this peculiar system of school finance, depending primarily on local wealth or poverty. The ultimate solution, I won't live to see this, but some of you young people may see it in your lifetime if you fight hard enough. The ultimate solution is to fund the education of every child in America, no matter what the town they live in, no matter what the state they live in, to fund the education of every child in America from the real wealth of our nation. And that means from the federal government. Now, I'm not proposing that the federal government run our schools. That's the last thing that I want. But there's an absurdity, total irrationality about relying on local wealth to finance education. I mean, let's face it, children in the United States, they do not go to school to become citizens of Arkansas or Idaho or West Virginia. And they don't go to school to be the citizens of specific towns. They don't go to school to be citizens of Boston or Richmond or New Orleans or Chicago. And they don't say a Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of any state. They say a Pledge of Allegiance in states where they still do the pledge to the flag of the United States of America. And if they grow up and end up serving in the military, they're not going to risk their lives and give up their lives in the name of California or Texas or Georgia or Florida. They'll die beneath the stars and stripes. So what we have today is what I would call an uneven social contract. And until that contract is ripped up and rewritten, we will never have equal education in America.
Since we're running a little short on time, I'll ask you one more of our pre-submitted questions. Why are our schools resegregating, and what can be done about it?
Good question. Well, probably the most decisive factor is a whole series of U.S. Supreme Court decisions, which I don't have exact dates in front of me, but which began at some point in the 1980s, early 1980s, when the balance of justices on the Supreme Court became far more conservative than they had been before. And at that point, during the period generally called the Rehnquist Court, and subsequently, the court has essentially ripped the guts out of the Warren Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. There have been a number of cases. I won't go into detail about the way it's been done, but essentially they stopped enforcing Brown. And worse than that, they ordered districts which had desegregated, which had become, in many cases, very successful and peacefully integrated districts with a good mix of children. In North Carolina, for example, in a district called Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which combined Charlotte with surrounding district, surrounding county, and many, many other cities where that was done. They ordered these these integration programs to be canceled, to be disbanded. And it also happened at the state level. In the St. Louis area, for instance, there had been this came somewhat later in St. Louis, there had been dramatic and highly successful metropolitan desegregation, which thousands of inner city kids from St. Louis were attending terrific suburban schools, just, short ride away. People sometimes say, oh, busing, that means hours on the bus. Well, not in most metropolitan areas. It's typically only 15, 20, 30 minutes, especially because in the morning they're going opposite to the rush hour traffic, and the same late in the day. All these programs have been disbanded, or a great many of them have been disbanded. In the St. Louis area, a number of the suburbs, just in a spirit of decency and because they think it's good for their own children, have continued these programs on a voluntary basis. But we have a similar program in the Boston area, a very good one that started around the same time that I published my first book, Death at an Early Age, and I taught in that program for a while, where thousands of inner city kids, not simply black, but black, Hispanic, and Vietnamese and others, ride the bus to something like 34 suburban districts right close to Boston. And the results are spectacular. They have typically a graduation rate well above 90%. Those who graduate, vast majority go on to four-year colleges. And that, you compare that to inner city graduation rates of 50 or 60% for minority kids. And it's worked out socially in a wonderful way. When those kids now, the grown-ups, now go back for their 10th high school reunion, white and black kids hug each other. They were friends. A lot of them are still friends. That's the way of making a wonderful democracy. But the courts have made it very hard. Districts that still do this have to do it on a voluntary basis. They're always scrambling for money. If President Obama wanted to do one remarkable thing before he leaves office, he would take back all the money that we're wasting now on these multi-billion-dollar testing corporations to try to create highest scoring apartheid schools. And instead, he'd deal a body blow to apartheid by establishing something like $100 billion incentive fund to school districts all around America that join arms with each other and form regional districts in which kids of different races go to school together. He's not going to do it, and he's never indicated that he would. But I hope we'll see the day when some president will think that's a good idea. I mean, they're spending billions of dollars. They spent billions of dollars for a program called Race to the Top under President Obama. That wasn't George Bush's policy. That was President Obama's policy, Race to the Top. And it rewarded local school districts. In order to get the money, they had to promise to establish very punitive regimes where they penalized teachers, firing teachers, for example, if they weren't pumping the scores fast enough. Even if the teacher just received 15 kids in the class who just arrived in the United States from Venezuela or Mexico or Africa. Instead of wasting all that money to bully our teachers and humiliate our local schools, he should have put that money into a spectacular incentive program to accelerate desegregation. My one hope is that depending on the outcome of the election, we might have a very different Supreme Court within a couple of years. If so, I think we ought to bring a new case to essentially reintroduce Brown versus Board of Education.
If it's okay with you, Mr. Kozol, we do have an audience member who'd like to ask you one more question.
Sure, I'm delighted. I see the person standing there. Hi.
Do you think that assimilation and the push for, is it working?
I can hear you.
Okay, and the push for like political correctness is affecting the schools? Like, could it maybe upset parents or students or teachers, and how does that affect how they learn in the school?
It's an interesting question. Could you expand a bit? Because political correctness is such a big term, what kind of political correctness are you thinking of that might upset parents, for example?
Like taking God out of the Pledge of Allegiance, or making all gender bathrooms, or...
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, look, I really respect you for getting up and having the courage to ask me that question, because I'm sure you can sense that being from Massachusetts, I'm probably a liberal. And so I'm glad you're gutsy enough to get up there and speak your mind. And I do think parents' wishes need to be respected. And I think we have to be very sensitive to the variety of passionately held views that parents have in any community, and they're usually not the same. They differ from each other. At the same time, I think that I don't think the separation of church and state is a matter of political correctness. I think that's a matter that's been well determined by countless precedents, and goes back to the early years of the Republic. I think it would be very, you can see that I have a religious inclination, but I don't want to impose that on people who don't share my beliefs. So I think it's proper that shouldn't be a part of any exercise that we carry out in school. I don't think we should be patronizing or condescending in any way about religion. That would upset me very much. But at the same time, I don't think we should advocate religion. I simply think that would be a tragic mistake. On the gender issue, that's one issue where I disagree with you. I do think it's important to to respect what we're now discovering for the first time to be very, a much wider array of gender identities than anyone ever dreamed of when I was a young man. And, it's new to me, but I respect it. I think that's the way it ought to be. But thanks for asking the question. And you can email me if you want to follow up. I won't give my email address aloud, but I'm sure your professor can tell you how to reach me, and I'd love to correspond with you.
Right, thank you.
We're approaching the end of our event, but before we leave, I do want to say a few brief words. As a reminder, as you exit the auditorium, please check out the books by Jonathan Kozol we have on sale in the foyer. I also want to say that I am personally thrilled to have been able to experience today's event. I've been a huge fan of Jonathan Kozol's work since picking up Savage Inequalities for the first time during my first semester in college. I'm very, very grateful he's been so generous with his time here today, especially considering how busy he is both as a writer and as a speaker. I know that my excitement and gratitude are shared by the rest of our community. Please join me in giving one final Concord University thank you to Jonathan Kozol.